Okay, so yeah, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see so many participants, or so many listeners. Yeah, I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging the land that I'm on. So this event is taking place for a lot of us on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of this land. My name's Ruby, and I'll be facilitating this discussion along with my good friend and colleague, Fergus Boyd. And we're both third-year undergraduate students at the University of Melbourne. And I might ask Fergus to just speak a bit about why we organised this particular event with this topic and what we sort of found interesting about it.
Yeah, welcome everyone. I think as linguists, we all know that grammars are core to the field and knowledge production. But as students, we've come to it from an interest, learning how to read and study grammars in our subjects. So we've tried to pitch it in a way to our fellow students, but I hope that everyone can learn something new about grammar production and data collection. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So we're going to get started with our 5 panelists that we have tonight. And by the way, for those of you who are listening, if you have any questions that you'd like to be addressed at the end of the presentation, at the end of the panel discussion, you can write them into the chat and Fergus and I will take note of them. So I thought we'd just start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and perhaps mention the language or the languages that they've focused on in their grammar writing, if that's relevant to them. And then to answer this first question that we've sort of thought of, which is what makes a descriptive grammar, good or bad, useful or not useful. So maybe perhaps we could start with Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Thieberger. I have written a grammar of Nufsan or South Ifate, language from central Vanuatu. And I'm very interested, and in that grammar I was very interested in figuring out how to make the grammar sit within a corpus, how to build a corpus so that the grammar could be a point of entry to the corpus and that other people could then explore aspects of the grammar that I didn't, or I did very minimally in the grammar. So I suppose that's my interest.
Did you have a perspective on what sort of makes a grammar?
Oh, we're going straight to point 1, are we? Okay.
Oh yeah, we might just ask everyone to answer that question while they introduce themselves. Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear.
All right. So for me, I mean, I think everybody here is going to have, you know, lots of things to say about grammars. My particular thing would be exactly that a grammar should be a point of entry and there should be a corpus underneath it. Now we have the technology, we have the means to do this. And for me, a good grammar gives you that point of entry. And so it doesn't provide examples that are disconnected from a corpus. It always tells you where an example comes from. It provides context and it allows further inquiry, because we know that, you know, grammars are written at a particular point in time and when our knowledge of grammar and sort of typology is at a certain level. But these things move on and we get new insights into language. And if we have a corpus, then other people can go and explore that corpus with these new questions in mind. So that's my answer, I suppose.
Thank you so much. Vania, would you like to introduce yourself and speak to that question as well?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. I am Vania Kapitonov, and currently I'm doing a postdoc at the Institute of Linguistics of the University of Cologne. And prior to that, I've written a grammar of Gunbarlang, which is a non-Pama-Nyungan language spoken in the top end of Australia. Yeah, at the University of Melbourne and supervised by Rachel Nordlinger and Ruth Singer, who I guess shaped many of my views of grammars, but should not be held accountable for them though. As for the good and bad, I think that a good grammar should be sort of very complete and clear. So a good grammar is a good analysis. A grammar obviously is not a collection of examples, as Nick has just pointed out. There's always, now we have this opportunity of a corpus sitting underneath it, and the grammar helps the reader make sense of the larger collection of data that they can access. And on the other hand, I guess the grammar should make very clear the points of interest and the mechanisms that the grammar writer is able to isolate during their analysis, right? So that said, I guess a good grammar is always very well exemplified. So I've seen grammars where you read through a lot of text and it might be insightful and interesting, but at some point you get lost because you want to see how that actually works out. So it's very important to keep the balance of making statements and then illustrating them. And saying that, I guess it's really important to always keep track of how consistent you are with what you say, because again, I've seen grammars where you see a statement and then some description of a paradigmatic mechanism, and then one example is given that is not really consistent with it. And you have the full text search and you go through the entire thing to look for more examples, but you just can't find any. So I guess it's always very important to sort of probe for alternatives and try to rule them out, because all those alternative analyses are also very confusing for the reader if they sort of start thinking along those lines. Yes, and also one last point, I think good grammar is always typologically well situated. It sort of meshes in with a second question. Maybe I'll just elaborate on that later on if we get to that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Could we hear from Alice now?
Oh, hello. So I'm Alice Gaby, and I have written a grammar of Kuuk-Thaayorre, which is a language of Cape York Peninsula here in Australia. And I, obviously strongly agree with everything that's been just said. I think crucially, for a grammar to be good, it has to be trustworthy and accurate. And I think no grammar is 100% accurate. I'm sure we all make mistakes or, have incomplete accounts of the language based on the data we have access to at the time of writing the grammar. But as Nick has said, if the grammar articulates with a corpus, so readers can go there to verify the claims made, or as Vania has said, having rich exemplification in the grammar, that's really crucial to build that trust in the reader that the analysis is accurate, and the reader might have additional questions that aren't answered in the grammar that they can satisfy by looking at that corpus and set of examples. So I think that's really crucial. I also think, it's important for the grammar to be respectful of the speakers of the language and what they do and don't want included, although, the extent to which that speech community is an audience for the grammar, I think is a question we'll get to later on, and a really difficult one in my experience. And then, again, I don't think there is an objective perfect grammar. I think different grammars are more or less good for different purposes, but whatever the intended users of the grammar are, a really good grammar will make it easy for those users to find whatever it is they're trying to find in the grammar as easily as possible in as much detail as possible.
Wonderful. We might just go to Lauren now.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lauren Gawne. you may hear a screaming child behind me, and I can't be bothered making an apology for that. I have done documentation and description work with a couple of varieties of Tibetic languages spoken in Nepal. That's included writing a sketch grammar of Lamjung Yolmo. And I've also written other grammatical descriptive work. That's one of the ways in which I come to this. The other way is that for the last 4 years, I've been a co-chair of the Research Data Alliance's Linguistic Data Interest Group, and we've been finding ways to give researchers more support for how they structure the citation of their data within their publications. So giving people practical ways to implement what Nick has suggested. And I have to say, like, I am on this panel, but also, you know, Rachel Nordlinger and Barb Kelly were my PhD supervisors. Nick Thieberger taught me how to do data management. Alice was my morphology tutor, I think. We are all products of the linguistics training that we have, and enmeshing ourselves in the best diversity of training that we can get is always a great start. And I think knowing that the grammars that we create are products that reflect the grammar of the language we're documenting, but also reflect our training and our background and our experience is really important. And I think as something that I think is good for a grammar that is additive to what everyone else has discussed, and not attempting to balance it against all the other things that are good attributes of a grammar, is that a good descriptive grammar is transparent. And by transparent, I mean that it makes very clear the process that went into creating the grammar and the researcher's stance. So I did a research project with Barb Kelly and Andrea Perez-Croker and a couple of colleagues where we surveyed 100 different descriptive grammars, dissertations, and published grammars as well. And what we found that across those 100 grammars, it was incredibly frustrating sometimes to not be able to even know how many speakers of the language that a researcher worked with to develop this grammar, or what primary data the researcher used. And it's not that a grammar written through your own introspection or through talking to one speaker is necessarily a less valid way to approach grammar writing, but letting people know that so they can evaluate whether they're dealing with a grammar that is synthesized across multiple speakers, or is essentially the grammar of, this is the way that Bob speaks Balti, is at least a first step to finding it as useful as possible to navigate as a text. So transparency would be my addition to the list of good features of a grammar.
Thanks for that. Unfortunately, we've had a couple of casualties, I suppose you could say, in Felicity, Meekins, and Barb. So we might go on to the next question. As Vania alluded to, we're thinking about, in creating a grammar, balancing, having it relevant to its local typology, as well as being able to describe it in a broader typology. So maybe Vania, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, as I said, indeed, I think that it really helps when you describe a language to highlight certain features and structures of it in comparison to other languages, both locally in the genetic context, in the areal context, as well as in broader typological context in what we know about language. And I think it's helpful in both ways, or in two ways. One being that it situates those mechanisms for the reader, but definitely one other point of importance of this is that it actually helps the grammar writer themselves to think about the questions that should be asked, or the opportunities in the analysis that they could consider and maybe push the sort of the analysis forward. So I think, given that I sort of view this as a value, I value the comparability as the, I guess, the primary value. And I actually think that the debate about the comparability versus the language's own terms is not, I don't feel personally that it's very well substantiated. And I think that the actual importance is in kind of explicit descriptions, right? So I don't think it ever hurts if you use cross-linguistically established terms, because you shouldn't stop at using a term and assume that now you've explained something. You use it to orient your reader, to give them sort of the first vector to orient them what kind of a phenomenon they would be dealing with. And then you still must very explicitly explain how that works. And because you would do that, that sort of neutralizes the any danger of doing injustice to the language. And you kind of would put in all the relevant detail that makes it actually the description of this language, so to say, the facts and in its own terms. And maybe to make a couple more points, if you do look into other languages for sort of inspiration and support, I feel like it's going to be unfair, because you look into other languages' grammars and you think, okay, I'm thinking about a certain phenomenon, say case, and you search for case in other languages to inform yourself better, and you'll read about the typology of case, and then you go back to your language and you avoid that term and you use something else just because case is a cross-linguistic term, and I don't know. So I feel like that might be a bit unfair from that point of view. And maybe more constructively, it's not even helpful. Like if you think about many phenomena where people used a lot of various terminology, what happens in the end is somebody comes back and says, okay, look, here's something, and we recognize this. We, doing some kind of analysis, we recognize these as things belonging to the same conceptual set of things, the same conceptual field. And here are all the dozens of the names that people use to refer to those things in their respective languages. And what people end up with is they still bring them together to have a some general discussion. And from that point of view, I guess it's only helpful to call things something similar from the outset, because it's not really about the terminology, it's about actually explaining the processes that you find. Maybe this is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I noticed, Nick, you were nodding enthusiastically. Did you want to say something to that? No? Okay, just agreeing. Well, then we might go to Alice. I know you had some thoughts on this question. How do you balance describing a language in its own terms while also making it comparable to other languages?
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts and no answers really, because I think this is just the perennial problem of grammar writing. And I think, you know, it's a balance, and it's a dance that we do. And the more we've read and can make connections to analogous categories in other languages, the more useful it is for readers. But it's just, I mean, linguistics is no different to any other field, but there's this terrible proliferation of terminology, and you've got, you know, all these different terms for more or less the same thing, and a single term being used in wildly different ways. And often there's a sort of local effect where researchers of a particular family of languages or in a particular linguistic area, or researchers who've been trained by particular other researchers will have sort of biases towards certain sets of terminology. And of course, the reader doesn't necessarily know that when they open the grammar. They may not be, used to reading grammars from that area, or people trained by Bob Dixon or whatever it may be. So, I think this isn't something that individual grammar writers are going to solve on our own. I think we as a field need to work towards a more consistent application of terminology and agreement about what all that terminology means. And in the meantime, and I think I very much agree with what Vania was saying, and I think we need to be clear. I mean, I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier on too, about the sort of trustworthiness of grammars and the level of explanation given, that we're not just throwing out there a word like dative case and assuming that everyone has the same idea of what a dative case covers and doesn't cover as the grammarian does, but actually describing what we mean and illustrating it with a rich set of examples. So the terminology used can be a kind of handy way in and a bit of a shortcut, but ultimately the analysis should emerge from the examples and the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very interesting. And I'm glad you bring up terminology, because that was going to be one of my questions that I asked afterwards, was how does a grammar sort of serve a community of speakers if it's kind of impenetrable in some ways for, like, at least I've found grammars in the past very, very complex and very dense. And I guess it's interesting, but it's also interesting with the way inherent in using certain terminology is like you subscribe to a certain theoretical viewpoint, like even choosing to call something a noun or call something a verb phrase. I wonder, this isn't one about the panel.
Okay, sorry, I was going to say, it's a pity Barb isn't here, because she's been doing some work with a history of linguistics colleague who's also a descriptive grammar writer, looking at the evolution of the table of contents of grammars over the decades. And you see strong influences, you see strong supervisorial influences. And I mean, I can personally attest to my work being very strongly shaped in very good ways by my supervisorial influences and their supervisorial influences influencing them as well. And I think this isn't a bad thing. We're all just products of the training that we get. But it is an interesting thing and a thing worth paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a reminder to the people listening that you can put any questions you might have into the chat, and we can address them after the panel discussion is over. I'm going to start putting questions in. If it's just me, I don't know, someone else, please put a question in as well. So we might move on to our third question. Fergus, would you like to introduce that one?
Sure. So we're now thinking about processes of data management when you're starting to write your grammar and develop your analysis. How do you manage the wealth of data you have so you don't have those kind of conflictions and gaps in your thought, like Vania said. So yeah, I think we have Nick to begin with a bit of a presentation. Go for it.
Yeah, so clearly, data management is a critical part of building a corpus, and not getting it right or leaving it until after you've done all your field work or after you've done your analysis just creates a huge burden. So getting good data management, which is really just thinking about what the things are you're working with, the files, naming them properly, keeping track of them, all of that kind of thing is really important. But then archiving, of course, is the critical extra bit, because if you're going to cite data, as Lauren said, you're going to create citation to your data and you're citing it in your grammar. It's no good if you're citing it to something that's on your laptop. You know, you want it to be cited to somewhere where other people can get access to it. So that would be in an archive. So we have to build archives, and we have to build more archives. We don't have enough of them. And I wanted to explore, so just as Lauren said, you know, you can go and look at how many grammars do what we're talking about. And I've just got I do have a little presentation. I'll just put it up and see if you can see this. Okay, so if you look at Glottolog, there were about 1,850 grammars produced between 1967 and 2020. So, you know, for each of these, there must be oodles of language records, right? And we can try that out by looking at OLAC. So if you don't know the Open Language Archives community, it has a page that is produced for each language in the world, and you have that URL there. If you stick the 3-letter code of the language you're interested in at the end of that URL, you'll get a page which shows you all the resources there are in the OLAC archives in the world. And there are about 60 OLAC archives in the world. So this isn't everything that there is about that language, but it's everything that's in a digital language archive that's part of OLAC. So here's an example. So for each language for which a linguist has done fieldwork, we can go and have a look at OLAC. And there's a little service that I had written, the URL is there, called OLAC Viz, which gives us a sort of visualizer of all the stuff that's in OLAC. So for a language that's been worked on, there should be lots of recordings, text, and so on. So 1,857 grammars produced. And if we talk about the post-Himmelmann time, so let's be generous to the people before that. They didn't really think about creating good documentation, but after Himmelmann, maybe people should have been thinking more about it, or at least they said they were thinking more about it. There were 832 grammars. So of those 832 languages, 661 have 40 or fewer items in an OLAC repository. So, you know, if you're doing some documentation work on a language, you know, you would have a number of recordings, you would have a number of transcripts, ideally photographs and other things. So 40 is not really very many. And then, you know, if we want to be generous again, you can take off the 100 languages which were funded by DOBIS or ELDP because they mandated archiving. So those languages absolutely should have, and even then we know that they don't all. That leaves 661, about 90% of languages that have grammars have too few records in the archives. And then if we look since 2016, again, still very few of these languages have good records in the archives. So there's still a long way to go, basically. That's the point of this little presentation. There's a lot of people talking about good documentation, and there's a lot of publications and a lot of cant. There's a lot of rhetoric, but when it comes down to it, not so many people are doing it. So there's still a long way to go. I don't think we need to think we've solved this one and we've broken the back of documentation. You know, there's still an awful long way to go to get good records of languages, in addition to the grammars, right? Obviously the grammars are central and important, but I think we all might agree that there's more to it than just the grammar.
Thank you so much, Nick. Lauren, did you have something to say about this question as well?
Yeah, and I can pick up Nick's number crunching from where he left off with the number of records that are produced per descriptive grammar, and the story continues to be pretty grim in the publication side. So of those 100 grammars that we surveyed, fully 5 of them link directly to the corpus of materials. And I'm pretty sure Alice and Nick's grammars are included in that list of grammars we surveyed and make up 2/5 of those numbers that cite back to sources. So I'm happy to say that you are in the company of panelists who really do know what they're doing and think in terms of best practice, in terms of the longevity of a descriptive grammar. And yeah, I can also say that for me, this was a learning process. I distinctly remember after my PhD confirmation talks, this is something that happens 12 months into your PhD process. Nick, in a comment, I'm sure he's forgotten because he says this to many people, and I'm not sure if all of them do listen. He was like, oh, you don't have any of your examples in your presentation linked to where you got them in the recordings. You might want to do that as you start getting more recordings. I was like, oh, I've already written so many words, but like, if I'm ever going to do it, now is the time. And there were at least 1 or 2 examples that I had written in the previous 3 months in that candidature document where I couldn't actually entirely tell you what part of my documentation they had come from. And that scared me into becoming someone who has invested a lot of time thinking about data management and how we archive, but also how we present that archive data to different audiences. And so part of that has been the creation of the Tromsø recommendations for the citation of data in linguistics. I've popped the DOI for that document in the Zoom chat. That is a way of, by creating a kind of style guide approach, we normalize this practice. It sounds incredibly condescending, but I just can't stress enough that linguists know how to cite stuff because we cite other publications all the time and we have a standard format for it and we don't bat an eyelid. In fact, when we don't, it's a problem. But when it comes to data and it comes to our own data, suddenly those standards that we're so used to applying to the citation of secondary documents goes out the window for us. And I want to see it normalized. We have seen it normalized in some spaces. University of Hawaii won't let you submit a PhD unless all the data is archived or in the process of being archived and cited. We see awards like the Dellerman Award encouraging data citation, increasingly journals linking to the Tromsø recommendations and asking people to cite their data, even if it's just acknowledging that the work you're submitting is introspection. And whether it's introspection of your own or introspection of your person who works down the corridor and speaks a different language. And I think these are, as I said, really important steps in terms of openness, ongoing utility of the documents we're creating, but thinking about it from the start is the key. And so for students, you actually have a lot more, you are in the right spot. People who have been doing documentation for years don't want to hear this. They don't want to know that they actually have to do something about the piles of cassettes that are sitting under their beds, about the SD cards that are sitting in piles in their shoeboxes, literally shoeboxes. That's why Toolbox started off being called Shoebox. But if you build this in as you go, it not only enhances the utility of your data for future users, community, or other researchers, but it enhances its utility for you. And I think, if anything, I can get on board with a selfish motivation. So that's my data management motivational talk for you this evening.
Thank you very much. Did any of the other panelists want to speak to that question or sort of expand on anything that Nick or Lauren said before we move on?
Can I just add something perhaps? Part of what we're not talking about is the way that these grammars can be responsive to the communities we work with. And Alice touched on it. But I think that the idea of the corpus and access to the corpus and creating good corpus is part of that responsibility back to the community that we work with, that we can create good materials that they can then access and use. And they're often much more interested in the texts that we've recorded than they are in arcane issues of grammaticography. So which is, you know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing grammatical analysis. We absolutely must. That's our job. But you know, if we can also create a good corpus, then that's something that the communities we work with, I think, are going to be much more interested in.
Well, I've just noticed that Barb has joined the Zoom. So Barbara Kelly was was our 5th panelist. Are you able to turn your camera on? It's okay.
I am. Sorry, I was late.
No worries. It's great to have you here. I wondered whether perhaps you might just be able to introduce yourself and the sort of the languages that you've been involved with, and then the question that we'd really love to hear your answer to is this second one. How do you balance describing a language in its own terms while also making it comparable to other languages?
Okay, thanks. I have worked deeply on one area in Tibeto-Burman languages, on Sherpa, which is a Tibeto-Burman language that's spoken in the Himalaya in Nepal. And I wrote a grammar of Sherpa and a glossary of Sherpa. And then in more recent years have been working on the acquisition of Murrumbidgee, an Australian language. And of course, they're very, very different languages. Thinking about this idea of how you might balance the description of a language while also making it comparable to other languages and keeping sort of the genius of the language at the forefront of a description, I think this is something that, or I know this is something that language workers have grappled with over centuries. And so from the perspective of writing grammars from Nepal, for example, one of the early grammars of a Nepalese language was written by not a linguist, but in fact the British consular general. And at the start, this was in 1860, and at the start of his grammar, he wrote a long sort of essay about the fact that this didn't fit Greek or Latin or German or any of the other grammatical sorts of descriptions that he'd seen before. And so he was going to write this grammar so that it highlighted what was important about this language, not in comparison to other languages. And it's a really lovely sort of reflection on how we can think about how we might describe a language. But of course, as part of writing a grammar, we need to make it comparable to other languages from a linguistic perspective. And I think that there are a couple of things that come into play here. So one of the things that I've been working on over the last few years with another linguist, Emile Lehostra, who's at CNRS in Paris, has been an examination of what goes into the writing of a grammar and what sort of models are important in the writing of grammars. And what do we, when we're writing grammars, know about the model on which we're basing the grammar that we're writing? And one of the things that we've found is that grammars tend to look like the grammars of the areas in which they're written. They often also tend to look like the grammars of the supervisors of people who have written grammars, if they've written them as PhD grammars. And Lauren can attest to this. So we looked at what we call chains of influencing grammars. And so we looked at people who have written grammars maybe 30 years ago, and their students and their students and then their students. And this is part of a much bigger ongoing project. And what we've found is that if you're not writing grammars that are heavily influenced by other people in the field, their comparability becomes really compromised. But the problem is that we need to have things that are similar in order for comparability. And so one of the things that we've found is that because of the digitisation of grammars, there's a lot more scope for writing descriptions of languages in their own terms while still maintaining the possibility of comparability with other languages. And so one of the things that I think has been an issue in the past has been the way that grammars are structured. So we either have sort of Paninian models where you have, some sort of phonetics and phonology, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, some sort of clause combining, this sort of structure, or we can have other kinds of structures that might mimic the sorts of things that we see as subjects. So things like phonetics, morphology, syntax, semantics, discourse. But all of these are now possible when we have digitized grammars. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but it's sort of thinking about comparability is something that, of course, we have to make the grammar a description in its own terms. But we also need, obviously, for that to be comparable. And I think that both are possible now.
That was great. Did any panelists want to follow on or add anything to that? No? Well, in that case, I think we've reached the end of the panel stage. So we might move into the questions that have been filtering in from the chat. And now is the time if any other people want to add some questions.
There's a question in the chat that is quite leads on quite nicely from what Barb was saying. Tiomir has asked, what do you think about digital reference grammars? I imagine most people have quite a positive perspective on that, but yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Can I leap in because Ruth also asked me to present on some work that Simon Musgrave and I've been doing on envisioning a linked digital grammar. So what we've done is, some of you would have heard this at various conferences because we've been working on it for a long time, but taking Heath's grammar of Wuboy or Nungaboyu from Eastern Arnhem, which is grammar, text, and dictionary and media, and making it into an online document. So let me just show you where we're at with it, because Simon's been doing a lot of work lately and it's very impressive. So it's online. We can do things like play media associated with interlinear text. We can link from texts back to other things. So here we are linking back to a dictionary, for example. Oh, now I've got all this Zoom stuff up here. We can navigate through texts. We can go and look at the dictionary and navigate through the dictionary. So this is all functioning. And this is all done by imposing coding on the text of Heath's work. So this isn't, most of this is done automatically using Heath's work. Heath had a whole lot of hyperlinks in his document, basically, that were done in the 80s on a courier typeface on paper. So he had the idea that grammars should be densely interlinked documents, right? Which they are. But instead of giving example sentences, for example, in the grammar, he would just point at the text, and you would have to then have the text volume open and the grammar open volume at the same time. So what we're doing is instantiating all of that and allowing people to do these links. We're using, so what you're looking at here is one of the chapters of the grammar. And one of the things you can do, if you look at this word here with a superscript G, you can switch the orthography to the community orthography. And now you're looking at the orthography that the community prefers, rather than the orthography that, that Heath actually used in his grammar. And we can do this by doing global changes through the two documents. One of the other things that you can do is that you can link back to the original page of the grammar. So if you're in doubt, and this is just good research practice that this is what we're talking about all the time, have the primary source available so you can go back and look at those things. And quickly, just another way of looking at this is using a common tool, TEI Publisher, which takes the grammar document and again allows you to look at the page of that as well. So you can look at the text and the page of the original document. So all of these are around. You can go and have a look at this stuff to live URL, but it just shows the sort of possibilities for encoding a dictionary, a grammar and texts and media. I'm not saying this is a template that we can use, but it's showing what this kind of digital grammar could be. And I think we're still a very long way, unfortunately, from that. But if we can get back to the idea of the primary objects we're dealing with, the bits of the text, we're getting there. We've got elan files. We can cite down to the level of an utterance or even a word in an alarm file. So this is where I think we're going, but obviously it's still a long way.
Nick, is that a link that you said was available for people
Yeah, I'll
to?
put the link in the chat.
Yeah, that would be great.
And not all of, not all of the links in the documents that you look at work. Some of them do, some of them don't, because it's still being developed. But be kind to us as you look at it.
I'm going to just briefly jump in and maybe be the tired, grumpy person in contrast to Nick's incredible optimism and capacity for imagination for what we could be doing, and say some of the challenges that we have in this endeavor are that we are constantly pushing against expectations in academia around what constitutes a publication. And the book that has page numbers and an ISBN and looks very pretty and solid and you can hold up at a book launch and counts for publication points in academic point scoring is a model that is very hard for us to shift against. I think it's absolutely worth shifting against. And we see, Nick for many years has been doing a lot of work. Other members of ALS who are here have been doing a lot of work trying to get the process of documentation recognised as the body of work, independent of the production of a grammar. And I also think we can continue to push forward with novel ways of presenting things, but having the flexibility to also present it as a publication. I should say important in academia, but also a lot of linguists note that it's really important to the communities they work with to return with something that looks like a book, that has that kind of weight of tradition behind it as well. And so digital grammar writing, working with corpora gives you that flexibility to print off. I've taken back books for people where it's comparatively trivial for me to bring back the picture book that has Nepali and English, or Shuba and Nepali, or just Shuba, because if you're working with the data, that gives you more flexibility, but you're always having to think critically about what you're doing and who you're doing it for. And there are structural changes that we still have to push for.
Thank you. That's incredibly interesting. I might go on to Evan's question in the chat, which is, in languages that have undergone significant change in the recent past, for example, a regional language under heavy influence from a modern national language, but which have poor or non-existent documentation for the previous stages, to what extent can or should the grammar writer also act as a historical linguist? Does someone have a perspective on that? Have you encountered that issue in the grammars that you wrote?
I will happily defer to others who have more experience in this, but just briefly, I would say that I think to a greater or lesser extent, this is a problem for all grammar writers. All languages are changing all the time, right? And so a grammar is really an artificial way of trying to provide a snapshot of a language at a particular moment of time, where there's inevitably going to be some variation across generations, across other kinds of demographic groups within the community, and the extent to which that's acknowledged and represented in the grammar. I mean, I think to an extent it depends on who's writing the grammar and where their interests and talents lie. I wouldn't want to read a grammar that tried to incorporate too much historical analysis if it was written by someone like me who doesn't have strong training or talents for historical linguistics. And I think, it comes back to what we were all talking about earlier about the transparency and the trustworthiness of the account. So I think as long as the grammar writer is really clear about what it is they're attempting to do and on what basis, and what else may be out there but falling outside of what they've tried to capture in the grammar, I think that's probably the best way forward.
Wonderful. I might jump in with a question from Ruby. Can we create a grammar that both contributes to language revitalization, i.e. serves the speakers, and advances the theoretical debate in linguistics, i.e. serves the academic field? Or do these two purposes require separate resources? Does anyone want to jump in?
I'm actually just going to ask Alice if she wants to talk about creating the plain language grammar with living languages, but also just to flag, and maybe because I am particularly tired at this moment in global history, that grammars are written by humans, and humans have finite capacity and energy. And if those humans are laboring under the conditions of a PhD, very much a finite period of time. And so it's important to ask these questions because it's important to conceptualize where you're putting your energy and your effort. And ideally, academic linguists would find space to do both of those things all of the time in exemplary ways, but we're actually just muddling through a middle ground at the best of times. But some people have been creating more resources that make this more feasible, including a template for a plain language grammar for Australian languages. Alice, you were involved in, yes?
Yeah, I was, although, you know, my contribution to it pales in comparison with others. I think she's no longer here, but Sharon Edgar-Jones was here a little while ago. If she's still here, she may have something to say, but she's working on plain language grammar based on the template that was put together by a collective of people at Living Languages, which I played a small role in. And I partly using that template, although my work on it long predates the template, I've been working on a plain language grammar for the community of Kuuk-Thaayorre speakers, alongside the academically oriented grammar. My experience is that the plain language version is just infinitely harder. I find it really, really extraordinarily challenging, and I'm just so full of admiration for people who've done it. But also I would really strongly encourage people to look out for Leslie Woods and all the work she's putting out. She is working on a plain language grammatical description of Nyamba for her PhD thesis at ANU. And I believe that's going to be a grammar that, you know, has a variety of audiences in mind, academic as well as community, which I think, you know, again, is an even more Herculean challenge than a purely community directed resource. So I have lots of thoughts. I think it's really important, but yeah, very, very challenging to do.
I just noticed also that Rachel Nordlinger has mentioned in the chat, my view would be that if you're trying to do two very different things with a single grammar, you are likely to end up doing both of them in a rather substandard way. Better to have different resources for different purposes. That sums it up very well. Well, I think we have come to the end of our panel discussion and question time. It's perfectly going to be 7 o'clock when we finish. So thank you so much, Alice, Barb, Lauren, Nick, and Vania. It was incredible to get to hear from you. And I think we will